When someone disappears without warning, people naturally begin looking backward. They replay conversations, revisit ordinary moments, and wonder whether something that seemed unimportant at the time was actually a warning. That is exactly what has happened in the case of Nancy Guthrie. Months after the 84-year-old vanished from her Tucson area home, one question continues to surface again and again. Was there something happening behind the scenes that only a handful of people knew about? And did Nancy's daughter, Annie Guthrie, notice something unusual before anyone else did? Those questions have fueled endless conversations online. Some of those conversations have gone far beyond the available evidence. Others have mixed facts with speculation until it became difficult to separate one from the other. News Nation reporter Brian Entin, who has spent months covering the case from Arizona, has repeatedly urged viewers to focus on what investigators actually know instead of internet rumors. He has also said publicly that he has seen no evidence implicating Annie Guthrie or any other family member, a position consistent with statements from the Pima County Sheriff's Department, which has said the family has been cleared as suspects. That would have been the end of it. But another detail stood out. Long before online theories exploded across social media, Annie Guthrie reportedly found herself answering investigators' questions and cooperating with every request they made. Her vehicle was collected as evidence early in the investigation, not because authorities announced she was a suspect, but because detectives were documenting and examining every possible piece of physical evidence connected to Nancy's final known hours. Officials later indicated the family had cooperated throughout the investigation. To understand why this matters, it helps to return to the beginning. Saturday, January 31, 2026, appeared to be an ordinary winter evening in southern Arizona. Nancy Guthrie spent time with her daughter Annie and Annie's husband Tommaso Scioni. Family dinners are rarely memorable while they are happening. There is conversation, laughter, familiar routines. Nothing suggests that everyone involved is unknowingly creating the final confirmed timeline before a loved one disappears. According to investigators, Nancy left Annie's home that evening and was driven back to her own residence. Around 9:50 that night, the garage door closed. That is the last confirmed time Nancy was known to be safe. Several hours later, the picture changed dramatically. During the early morning hours of February 1, surveillance systems around Nancy's home recorded unusual activity. A masked individual approached the property. Investigators later recovered footage showing someone tampering with the home's doorbell camera. Shortly afterward, Nancy's medical monitoring equipment stopped communicating as expected. By late morning, concern had grown. Nancy had failed to appear for a scheduled church activity. Family members went to check on her home. Instead of finding her inside, they found a deeply troubling scene that immediately led authorities to suspect she had not left voluntarily. Blood recovered near the entrance was later confirmed to belong to Nancy. Investigators soon described the case as an abduction rather than a typical missing person investigation. From that point forward, the investigation expanded rapidly. Federal agents joined local detectives. Crime scene specialists processed the property. Digital evidence was collected. Neighbors were interviewed. Doorbell cameras throughout the area were reviewed. Every hour seemed to produce another question. Brian Entin arrived in Arizona early in the investigation and remained one of the few national reporters consistently covering developments from the scene. Viewers became familiar with his daily reports because he focused less on dramatic theories and more on documenting what investigators were doing from one day to the next. Still, as weeks passed without an arrest, public attention naturally shifted toward those closest to Nancy. That is not unusual in missing person cases. Family members are often discussed first simply because investigators routinely begin with the people who knew the missing person best. Being questioned, having vehicles examined, or providing DNA samples does not automatically imply suspicion. Experienced investigators often describe those steps as standard procedure. Even so, online speculation grew. Some internet users began suggesting that Annie Guthrie must have been conducting her own investigation before her mother's disappearance. Others claimed she had uncovered information that had never been shared publicly. Stories spread quickly across video platforms, discussion boards, and social media pages. The difficulty is that very little evidence supports those claims. Brian Entin has directly addressed these rumors. He said he has never seen evidence linking Annie or Tommaso Scioni to Nancy's disappearance, and reminded viewers that the sheriff publicly cleared the immediate family. Entin even acknowledged feeling sympathy for the family, noting how difficult it must be to endure both the disappearance itself and constant accusations from strangers online. That does not mean Annie had no concerns before February 1. Like many adult children with elderly parents, she likely knew Nancy's routines well. Families notice small changes that outsiders rarely see. If a parent misses church unexpectedly, fails to answer the phone, or breaks from long-established habits, relatives often recognize that something is wrong long before anyone else would. Records show that concern developed quickly, once Nancy failed to appear where she was expected. Family members checked on her home and contacted authorities after discovering she was missing. At first, that seemed straightforward. Then something unexpected happened. The case became flooded with supposed ransom communications. Letters appeared. Emails surfaced. Anonymous messages claimed Nancy had been kidnapped. Others claimed she had already died. Still others demanded enormous sums of cryptocurrency. Each new message created another wave of headlines. Yet investigators repeatedly urged caution. Authorities have confirmed that at least some ransom communications were fraudulent. One individual even pleaded guilty after sending a fake ransom message connected to the case. Experts interviewed about the investigation have questioned whether any of the remaining messages are genuine, noting the absence of convincing proof of life and other characteristics commonly seen in authentic kidnapping cases. The FBI has continued evaluating communications individually while warning against jumping to conclusions. For Annie and the rest of the family, those developments added another painful layer. Every message created hope. Every false lead created disappointment. Every rumor generated another round of public speculation. Meanwhile, detectives quietly continued examining physical evidence. One of the most discussed pieces of evidence has been DNA recovered from the scene. Brian Entin has repeatedly suggested that advances in forensic testing may ultimately provide the breakthrough investigators need, though no publicly announced match has identified a suspect. That brings us back to Annie. Many videos online use dramatic titles suggesting she secretly investigated something before Nancy vanished. The publicly available evidence tells a more restrained story. There is no confirmed report that Annie uncovered a hidden conspiracy before her mother's disappearance. There is no verified evidence showing she discovered the identity of a suspect or warned investigators in advance. What is documented is that she became one of the most important witnesses simply because she was among the last people known to have seen Nancy alive. She fully cooperated with investigators, and authorities have repeatedly stated that the family has been cleared. Yet one mystery refuses to disappear. Investigators continue examining Nancy's final movements, her daily habits, and the people who may have observed her routines. Detectives have also looked closely at whether someone could have been watching the home long before the abduction occurred. If that happened, someone may have been quietly gathering information well before the night Nancy disappeared. And if someone else was watching Nancy, who were they? One of the reasons this case has remained so compelling is that investigators have never described it as random. From the earliest days of the investigation, detectives treated Nancy Guthrie's disappearance as a targeted event. The condition of the home, the blood evidence recovered at the scene, and the surveillance footage all suggested that someone had come to the property with a purpose. That immediately raised another question. If Nancy was specifically targeted, how much did that person know about her routine? For people who had lived in the neighborhood for years, Nancy's habits were hardly a secret. Neighbors have described her as someone who maintained a predictable schedule. She attended church regularly, remained active despite her age, and was well known in the community. Like many retirees, she valued routine. Routine can be comforting. It can also become predictable. Investigators have never publicly identified a suspect, but they have spent considerable time examining whether someone may have observed Nancy over a period of days or even weeks before she disappeared. Detectives have reviewed surveillance footage from nearby homes, businesses, and traffic cameras in an effort to determine whether unfamiliar vehicles repeatedly appeared in the area. Officials have not publicly disclosed the results of that review. At first, that seemed like a routine investigative step. Then another detail began attracting attention. According to Brian Entin's reporting, investigators continued collecting digital evidence long after the initial search of the home. Phones, electronic devices, surveillance systems, and communications all became part of a much larger effort to reconstruct Nancy's final days. Unlike television crime dramas, these examinations rarely produce instant answers. Digital forensic work can take months, sometimes even longer. Every deleted message, every login, every location record, every timestamp, each one has to be verified before detectives can decide whether it matters. That slow process has frustrated many people following the case. Weeks turned into months without a public arrest. As that happened, internet speculation filled the silence. Some online commentators insisted Annie Guthrie must have discovered something suspicious before Nancy vanished. Others suggested she had been conducting her own investigation into people around her mother. Those claims spread rapidly because they offered a simple explanation. The problem is that investigators have never confirmed any of them. Brian Entin has repeatedly cautioned viewers against treating online theories as established fact. During several televised updates, he reminded audiences that detectives possess far more evidence than has been released publicly. He also emphasized that withholding information is often necessary to protect an active criminal investigation. That distinction matters. Police do not reveal every piece of evidence they collect. Sometimes they are waiting to compare statements from future witnesses. Sometimes they are protecting information that only the perpetrator would know. Sometimes they are testing whether false confessions contain details that were never made public. Because of that, the absence of public information does not necessarily mean investigators have no leads. Records show that hundreds of tips have been submitted since Nancy disappeared. Authorities have continued asking the public for information while following up on reports from Arizona and beyond. Some tips have led nowhere. Others required weeks of investigation before being ruled out. That steady flow of information created another challenge: separating credible evidence from deliberate misinformation. As the case attracted national attention, individuals claiming inside knowledge began appearing online. Some insisted they knew where Nancy was being held. Others claimed they had spoken with the kidnappers. Several anonymous accounts circulated screenshots that supposedly proved secret communications with investigators. Very few of those claims survived even basic scrutiny. Law enforcement repeatedly warned the public that misinformation could interfere with the investigation. False reports consume valuable time, forcing detectives to investigate leads that ultimately prove baseless. For Nancy's family, every false rumor came with an emotional cost. Imagine answering the telephone believing someone finally has real information. Imagine opening an email that promises hope, then discovering it was fabricated. That cycle repeated itself more than once. One of the most widely discussed developments involved the Ransom communications. Investigators confirmed that numerous messages had been received, claiming responsibility for Nancy's disappearance. However, authorities have never announced that any of those communications established proof that Nancy was alive after the abduction. Experts familiar with kidnapping investigations have pointed out that authentic ransom demands often include specific evidence demonstrating that the victim is still alive. In Nancy's case, investigators have been far more cautious about assigning credibility to the messages that surfaced publicly. Brian Entin has echoed that cautious approach during his reporting, noting that investigators continue evaluating evidence rather than reaching conclusions prematurely. Then something else happened. Forensic science quietly moved closer to the center of the investigation. Early in the case, investigators recovered biological evidence from Nancy's property. While officials have released only limited information, they have acknowledged that DNA analysis remains an important part of the investigation. Modern forensic technology has solved cases once considered impossible. Sometimes investigators identify a suspect through traditional DNA comparison. Other times, genetic genealogy opens entirely new avenues by connecting unknown DNA to distant relatives in public genealogy databases used with appropriate legal procedures. Authorities have not announced that such techniques have identified a suspect in Nancy's case. But Brian Entin has noted that many experienced investigators remain optimistic that forensic evidence could eventually produce answers. That optimism is based on history. Across the United States, cold cases decades old have been solved because evidence collected years earlier was preserved properly. Technology improved. Testing became more sensitive. Names finally emerged. Whether that will happen here remains unknown. Meanwhile, Annie Guthrie has continued living under intense public attention. It is difficult to overstate how dramatically life changes when a loved one disappears in a nationally followed case. Every public appearance is analyzed. Every facial expression becomes the subject of online discussion. Every interview is replayed. Silence is criticized. Speaking publicly is criticized. There is often no winning. Brian Entin has openly discussed the dangers of internet speculation, explaining that accusations unsupported by evidence can deeply affect innocent people. In this investigation, authorities have consistently maintained that Annie and other immediate family members cooperated fully and have not been identified as suspects. That would have reassured many families. But for those hoping for a quick resolution, it also meant investigators were still searching elsewhere. So where? That question has become one of the biggest mysteries in the entire investigation. Were detectives looking for someone Nancy knew only casually? A service worker? A passing acquaintance? Someone who had observed her routine without ever speaking to her? Or someone completely unknown to her? Investigators have not answered those questions publicly. What they have continued to say is remarkably consistent. Someone knows something. Someone may remember seeing an unfamiliar vehicle. Someone may have noticed unusual activity near Nancy's neighborhood. Someone may have dismissed an odd encounter because it seemed insignificant at the time. Many major investigations are ultimately solved not by a dramatic confession, but by a small detail that initially appeared unimportant. A receipt, a surveillance image, a forgotten conversation, a vehicle seen parked in the wrong place. A phone record that suddenly makes sense after months of analysis. As detectives continued piecing together Nancy's final known hours, another issue quietly became increasingly important: time. Because with every passing month, memories fade. Witnesses become less certain. Security footage is overwritten. Potential evidence disappears. Yet despite those challenges, investigators have repeatedly stated that the case remains active. Detectives continue reviewing evidence, following tips, and coordinating with federal partners. For Brian Entin, one thought has remained consistent throughout his coverage. The answer may already exist within the evidence investigators have collected. The challenge is recognizing which single detail connects everything else. And if that detail has been sitting quietly inside the case file all along, what exactly are investigators waiting to confirm before they reveal it to the public? By the time months had passed, many people expected investigators to hold a dramatic press conference announcing an arrest. That never happened. Instead, the case settled into a quieter phase. Detectives continued working. Laboratories continued examining evidence. Tips continued arriving. Brian Entin continued returning to the story whenever a meaningful development occurred, reminding viewers that an active investigation often looks very different from what television dramas portray. The most important work frequently happens behind closed doors, long before the public hears about it. For Nancy Guthrie's family, however, there was no quiet phase. Every day began with the same unanswered question: where is Nancy? Every phone call carried a possibility. Every unfamiliar number could have been the one that changed everything. Families of missing people often describe living in two worlds at once. One part of life continues because it has to. Bills still need to be paid. Meals still need to be prepared. Birthdays still arrive. Holidays still appear on the calendar. But another part of life remains frozen at the moment their loved one disappeared. That reality has been echoed by organizations that support families of missing persons. They describe it as ambiguous loss, a situation in which there is no clear ending, leaving families caught between hope and uncertainty. That emotional burden became even heavier as false information continued circulating online. Some social media posts claimed arrests were imminent. Others insisted investigators had secretly solved the case. Several videos used dramatic headlines suggesting that Annie Guthrie had uncovered explosive information before Nancy disappeared, or that Brian Entin had revealed a hidden breakthrough. When viewers watched those reports, they often discovered something very different. In reality, Entin's reporting has consistently emphasized verified developments. He has repeatedly distinguished between confirmed investigative facts and speculation shared online. That approach may not generate the most sensational headlines, but it reflects an important principle of responsible reporting. Evidence comes first. That brings us back to the question in this video's title: what did Annie Guthrie secretly investigate before Nancy vanished? Based on everything that has been confirmed publicly, there is no verified evidence that Annie was conducting a secret investigation before her mother's disappearance. No law enforcement agency has announced such a finding. No court document describes one. No public investigative record confirms it. What has been documented is something much more grounded: Annie was one of the last confirmed people to spend time with Nancy. She quickly recognized that something was wrong when Nancy failed to follow her normal routine. She cooperated with investigators. Her vehicle and other potential evidence were examined. Authorities later stated that the immediate family had been cleared as suspects. Those facts have remained consistent, even as countless theories have appeared online. Sometimes the truth is less dramatic than the rumors. It is also more reliable. That does not mean the investigation has reached a dead end. Far from it. The Pima County Sheriff's Department has continued describing the case as active. The FBI remains involved, and authorities have repeatedly encouraged anyone with relevant information, even something that may seem minor, to come forward. History offers many examples of investigations that appeared stalled before suddenly moving forward. A witness remembers a forgotten detail. A new forensic technique produces a match. A person who remained silent decides it is finally time to speak. A piece of evidence that once seemed insignificant suddenly fits into a larger picture. Investigators know this. That is why evidence is carefully preserved. That is why detectives revisit witness statements. That is why cold case reviews sometimes solve crimes decades after they occurred. Brian Entin has often expressed confidence that persistence matters. While he has avoided predicting when the case will be solved, his reporting has reflected the belief shared by many experienced investigators. As long as evidence exists and people continue searching for answers, there remains the possibility of a breakthrough. One aspect of Nancy's disappearance continues to stand out. Investigators have consistently indicated that the circumstances suggest she did not leave voluntarily. That distinction has guided the entire investigation from the beginning. It explains why federal resources were brought in. It explains why forensic testing has remained such a priority. It explains why authorities continue asking for information, rather than treating the case as closed. For viewers who have followed every update, waiting has not been easy. Every headline raises expectations. Every news conference creates hope. Every rumor promises answers. But responsible investigations rarely unfold according to public timelines. Detectives must build cases that can withstand scrutiny in court, not just satisfy public curiosity. That takes patience. It takes documentation. It takes evidence. As of today, many important questions remain unanswered. Who entered Nancy's property that night? What was the motive? Was Nancy specifically targeted, or did circumstances unexpectedly change after the intruder arrived? Did anyone unknowingly observe something that has not yet been recognized as important? Those are the questions investigators continue working to answer. Until they do, separating verified information from speculation remains essential. Cases like this remind us how quickly rumors can spread and how easily repeated claims can begin to sound like established facts. They also remind us why experienced investigators insist on evidence before conclusions. Nancy Guthrie's disappearance has affected far more than one family. It has touched neighbors, friends, church members, investigators who have spent months pursuing leads, journalists committed to reporting responsibly, and thousands of viewers who continue hoping that one day this story will end with clear answers rather than lingering uncertainty. Perhaps the next significant development will come from forensic science. Perhaps it will come from a witness who finally recognizes the importance of something they saw months ago. Or perhaps it will come from someone who has carried a secret for far too long and decides that the time for silence has ended. No one outside the investigation knows which possibility is correct. What we do know is that the search for the truth continues. If you've been following Nancy Guthrie's case, what detail has stood out to you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments, but remember to separate confirmed facts from speculation and to respect those whose lives have been changed by this investigation. If you found this report informative and want fact-based updates on major investigations, as new information becomes available, consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you for watching, and we'll continue following this case closely as verified developments emerge.